When John Carlyle moved to a quiet suburb, he expected peace. Instead, he found war. The neighbors claimed his land, and their leader, Karen, vowed to break him. What she didn't know? He's the sheriff. John Carlyle had always imagined a peaceful retirement when he finally left the chaotic streets of the city behind. A career in law enforcement had hardened him, taught him patience, and given him a deep appreciation for the rule of law. But more than anything, it had made him crave peace. Something he thought he had secured when he bought a sprawling property on the outskirts of a picturesque suburban town. His house, a sturdy yet charming two-story home, sat on a large plot of land at the edge of a well-maintained residential community, just beyond the reach of its HOA. The previous owner had left no fences or barriers, which in hindsight had been a mistake. It didn't take long for John to notice the problem. Every morning and evening, cars zipped across his property, using his land as an unofficial shortcut between two parallel roads. At first, he chalked it up to a few lost drivers, but when he saw the deep tire tracks carving through the grass and a steady stream of vehicles, some even honking impatiently as if they were on a public road, he knew it wasn't a coincidence. His front yard had been turned into a makeshift thoroughfare. He found it almost comical at first. Almost. After a week of observing the traffic, John decided to take action. He installed a simple sign that read, "Private property, no trespassing." He figured that would be enough. It wasn't. By the next morning, the sign was gone. A few days later, when he replaced it with another, it was not only removed, but tossed back onto his porch, snapped in half. That's when the realization hit him. This wasn't just thoughtless drivers. This was intentional. Someone in the neighborhood believed they had a right to his land. It didn't take long for the complaints to start. As he worked in his yard one afternoon, an older man walking his dog slowed down just enough to glare at him. "You really should reconsider blocking off the access road," the man grumbled. John raised an eyebrow. "It's not an access road. It's my land." The man scoffed and walked off without another word. The next day, a middle-aged woman in yoga pants stopped her luxury SUV at the edge of his driveway and rolled down her window. "You must be the new guy," she said, in that sweet, condescending tone John had learned to recognize. "I don't think you understand how things work around here." John wiped the sweat from his brow and leaned against his shovel. "Why don't you enlighten me?" She gave him a practiced smile. "People have been using this road for years. The previous owner didn't mind. It's a matter of community convenience. Blocking it off is just, well, it's not very neighborly." John let out a slow breath, already irritated. "Ma'am, I don't care what the last guy did. This is private property, not a public road. No one has the right to cut through here." Her smile tightened. "That's not how the neighborhood sees it." John knew a veiled threat when he heard one. He folded his arms. "That's their problem, not mine." She stared at him for a long moment before her lips curled into something more akin to a smirk than a smile. "I see. Well, don't be surprised when people start pushing back." And with that, she rolled up her window and drove off, making a deliberate turn through his yard as she left. John had dealt with criminals, gangs, and bureaucratic nightmares in his time as a cop. But something about entitled suburbanites, with a misplaced sense of ownership, sent a different kind of irritation crawling up his spine. He had the legal documents to prove his land was his, and his alone. He wasn't about to let some overinflated sense of community entitlement change that. 2 days later, Karen Wallace arrived. He didn't know her name at first, but everything about her screamed authority. The type of authority that wasn't actually official but was wielded as if it were. Dressed in a crisp white blouse, beige slacks, and oversized sunglasses, she marched toward his property like a general approaching a battlefield. In one hand, she clutched a folder of paperwork. In the other, a designer purse that looked like it had never touched a surface in its life. "Mr. Carlyle," she called out as she stepped onto his driveway. John glanced up from where he was tightening a new no trespassing sign into the ground. "That's me." She extended a perfectly manicured hand. "Karen Wallace, president of the Willow Creek HOA. We need to talk about your little project." John didn't take the offered handshake. He didn't belong to the HOA. His land was just outside their jurisdiction. He already had a feeling. She knew that, but didn't care. "Not a project," he corrected. "Just protecting my property." Karen's smile was all teeth. "That's where we disagree." Karen Wallace was not a woman who took no for an answer. She had spent years shaping Willow Creek into what she considered a model community, enforcing HOA rules with an iron fist disguised as a well-manicured hand. And now, this outsider, this stubborn, uncooperative man was threatening the very order she had spent years maintaining. Standing in front of John, she plastered on a diplomatic smile, the kind that never reached her eyes. "Mr. Carlyle, I understand that you're new here, so I'll give you the benefit of the doubt," she said in a tone dripping with condescension. "But the fact is, the neighborhood relies on that access road. People have been using it for years. The previous owner never had an issue, and—" John cut her off, crossing his arms over his chest. "That's the problem, Ms. Wallace. It's not an access road. It's my land." Karen's smile didn't falter, but a flicker of irritation crossed her face. "Be that as it may, we have community standards to uphold. I think you'll find that working with the HOA makes life easier for everyone. If you simply take the fence down, I'm sure we can avoid any unpleasantness." There it was. The threat wrapped in a veneer of civility. John had seen it before. Different setting, same entitled attitude. "I don't know what kind of power you think you have, Ms. Wallace, but the HOA doesn't govern my land. And the fence stays." Karen let out a small, humorless laugh, tilting her head. "Well, if that's how you want to play it." She turned sharply on her heel and marched away, her heels clicking against the pavement with purpose. John watched her leave, already knowing this wasn't over. The next morning, John found his trash cans overturned, their contents scattered across his driveway. He hadn't put them out yet. Someone had gone out of their way to drag them from the side of the house just to make a mess. Annoying, but nothing he couldn't handle. He cleaned it up and went about his day. Then came the petty complaints. Twice that week, John received official-looking notices in his mailbox from the HOA, claiming violations for things like unkempt lawn and unauthorized fencing. Each time he ignored them. He wasn't part of the HOA, and they had no authority over his land. Then, his mail stopped arriving on time. Packages went missing. When he called the post office, the clerk hesitated before admitting that someone from the HOA had filed a change of address request on his behalf. That got his attention. John marched straight to the post office, had the changes reversed, and put in an official fraud complaint. If Karen wanted to play dirty, she was in for a surprise. He was more than willing to play back. A few days later, the neighborhood newsletter arrived in everyone's mailbox. The front page had a thinly veiled article about how certain residents were disrupting the harmony of Willow Creek by selfishly blocking community access. It didn't mention John by name, but it didn't have to. That afternoon, John found a small crowd gathered near his property, neighbors whispering and glancing at his fence like it was a personal insult. One older woman shook her head. "This wasn't an issue before," she muttered. John wasn't the type to give speeches, but he also wasn't about to let Karen control the narrative. So he walked out onto his porch and called out, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Funny, I don't remember signing up for an HOA." Silence. A few people shuffled awkwardly. Karen wasn't present, but her influence was. "I bought this land because it's private property," John continued. "If any of you think I'm going to let a bunch of entitled people tell me what to do with it, you're in for a disappointment." Some of them looked uncertain, as if they had only just considered that Karen might not be entirely in the right, but others still held firm. One man in a golf shirt crossed his arms. "You're not making any friends here." John shrugged. "I didn't move here to make friends. I moved here for peace and quiet. But I'll tell you one thing. Anyone who tries to mess with my property is gonna learn real fast why that's a bad idea." And with that, he turned and walked back inside, leaving the crowd murmuring behind him. Karen had officially declared war. But John? He was just getting started. That night, John barely got a few hours of sleep. Around 2 a.m., his motion-activated floodlights flared to life, illuminating two figures in hoodies creeping toward his fence. He watched from the upstairs window as they moved quickly, one pulling out a bolt cutter, the other holding a spray paint can. John sighed. Amateurs. Instead of rushing out, he grabbed his phone and zoomed in with the camera. The grainy but clear footage showed one of them cutting through the lower section of his fence, while the other sprayed "community access" in big, sloppy letters across the wooden panels. John let them get halfway through their crime before stepping onto his porch, his deputy badge flashing in the moonlight. "You two might want to rethink your life choices." The would-be vandals froze. For a moment, there was complete silence. Then one dropped the bolt cutters and ran. The other, slower to react, barely had time to stumble backward before John clicked on his radio. "This is Sheriff Carlisle. I need a unit on my property. Trespassers in action." The second guy panicked, trying to run, but tripped over the fallen tool, landing face first in the dirt. By the time deputies arrived, John had zip-tied the kid's hands behind his back and was casually drinking coffee on his porch. "Caught him mid-crime," John said as the officers took over. "Check the footage. Looks like someone doesn't like private property." The deputies exchanged amused glances. They already knew who had sent these kids, or at least who had encouraged them. Karen was escalating. By morning, John received a summons from the town zoning office. A complaint had been filed against him for unauthorized fencing and obstructing community pathways. He nearly laughed. John spent an hour going over his property deeds, then made one phone call to the county clerk. Within minutes, the case was dismissed. His fence was 100% legal, but that wasn't the end of it. Next, his water was shut off. When he called the utilities department, they told him a member of the HOA had requested service termination due to an unpaid balance. John drove straight to their office, documents in hand, proving he had never missed a payment. Within an hour, his water was restored. But now, it was personal. If Karen wanted a war, John would show her why fighting the law was a terrible idea. John had dealt with plenty of criminals in his career, gang leaders, drug dealers, and con artists. But Karen Wallace, she was something else. Her arrogance wasn't fueled by desperation or greed. It was fueled by entitlement, and that made her dangerous. After her petty sabotage attempts failed, Karen realized she needed to go bigger. The fence hadn't come down, and John hadn't caved under pressure. Worse, some of the neighbors were starting to question her leadership. So she did what any power-hungry HOA tyrant would do. She forged a legal document. It happened early in the morning. John had just poured himself a cup of coffee when he heard the unmistakable sound of heavy machinery outside. Setting his mug down, he moved to the window and froze. A bulldozer. A damn bulldozer was rolling up to his fence. And standing right in front of it, barking orders like a conquering general, was Karen Wallace. John exhaled slowly, already reaching for his belt where his badge and handcuffs rested. This woman had just crossed the line from annoying to criminal. By the time he stepped onto his porch, the bulldozer's engine roared to life, and the metal blade slammed into his gate, sending wooden splinters flying. Karen turned toward him with a triumphant smirk, waving a stack of papers in her manicured hand. "You're trespassing on community land, Sheriff," she called out, her voice dripping with smug satisfaction. "The HOA has officially reclaimed this area as public property. Your fence is illegal, and as of today, it's coming down." John remained still for a moment, then casually pulled out his phone, recording the scene. "Karen," he said, his voice calm, but edged with steel. "Do you know what the penalty is for falsifying property records?" Karen's smirk faltered. "Excuse me?" John stepped forward, holding up his own set of documents. Real, legally verified ones. "This land belongs to me. It always has. You filed a fraudulent easement request and I can prove it." Karen's face paled slightly, but she quickly recovered, doubling down. The community has the right to remain silent. And with that, John pulled out his handcuffs. Karen's eyes went wide. "You can't be serious." John took another step forward, badge gleaming in the morning sun. "Karen Wallace, you're under arrest for vandalism, destruction of private property, and filing fraudulent legal documents." Behind her, the workers operating the bulldozer immediately shut the machine off. They weren't paid enough to get involved in this mess. Karen tried to step back, but John was faster. The cold clink of metal locking around her wrists was the most satisfying sound he'd heard all week. As he led her toward his patrol car, the neighbors gathered around, whispering and recording on their phones. The same people who had once doubted him now looked at him with a mix of awe and realization. And just like that, Karen Wallace's reign was over. The courtroom was packed. News of Karen Wallace's arrest had spread like wildfire through Willow Creek, and the trial had become the event of the year. Residents who once stood behind Karen now whispered among themselves, eager to see how the self-proclaimed queen of the HOA would fare against the full force of the law. John sat at the prosecution's table, arms crossed, watching as Karen was led into the courtroom, wearing a tailored blazer, but with the unmistakable stiffness of someone trying to maintain dignity under pressure. She had been released on bail, but her usual smug confidence was visibly cracking. The state prosecutor, a sharp-eyed woman named Melissa Grant, stepped forward. "Your Honor," she began, "we intend to prove that the defendant, Karen Wallace, knowingly falsified legal documents, engaged in property destruction, and used her position as HOA president to misappropriate funds and manipulate local governance for personal gain." Karen's lawyer, a sleek, overpaid man in an expensive suit, stood up. "Your Honor, my client is a respected member of the community. She was merely acting in what she believed to be the best interest of the neighborhood." John scoffed under his breath. "She ordered a bulldozer onto private property. If that was acting in the neighborhood's best interest, then so was bank robbery." The prosecution's first move was devastating. "Your Honor," Grant continued, "we have video footage of the defendant overseeing the destruction of private property while holding falsified legal documents." The court's large screen flickered to life, showing John's recording of Karen, standing proudly in front of the bulldozer, waving her fake documents as his fence was torn apart. The jury murmured. The judge leaned forward slightly, eyes narrowing. Karen's lawyer shifted uncomfortably, but before he could object, Grant continued. And it doesn't stop there. She held up a thick folder. We have copies of the fraudulent documents, which the county clerk's office has confirmed were doctored. The original survey clearly states that this land was never part of the HOA. She walked over to the judge, presenting the evidence. Furthermore, Grant added, turning back to the jury, we have financial records showing that Mrs. Wallace has been illegally collecting additional HOA fees from residents, claiming they were for community maintenance. Instead, those funds were funneled into her personal expenses, including, she picked up another document and read aloud, a weekend spa retreat in Palm Beach, multiple luxury handbags, and, most shocking of all, a $12,000 renovation to her own backyard pool. The courtroom erupted. Gasps rippled through the audience, and some of the residents whispered angrily among themselves. John glanced toward the crowd and saw a few of the same neighbors who once supported Karen now looking outraged. Karen's lawyer stood quickly. Objection! These financial matters are unrelated to the charges. The judge held up a hand. Overruled. I want to hear more about these financial records. Karen's face was now a mask of barely contained panic. It didn't take long for the jury to reach a decision. After deliberating for just 3 hours, they returned with their verdict. The foreman stood, cleared his throat, and spoke with crisp finality. On the charges of vandalism, destruction of private property, and falsification of legal documents, we find the defendant guilty. Karen let out a quiet gasp, her carefully curated poise crumbling. The judge adjusted his glasses, staring down at Karen before delivering his sentence. Mrs. Wallace, your actions not only violated the law, but also betrayed the trust of your community. You abused your power, manipulated legal processes, and destroyed private property under false pretenses. He leaned forward slightly. You are hereby sentenced to 2 years of probation, 6 months of house arrest, and ordered to pay $50,000 in damages to Mr. Carlisle for the destruction of his property. Karen's lawyer looked stunned. And Karen? She looked ready to faint. The judge wasn't finished. Furthermore, he added, given the financial misconduct within the HOA, an independent audit will be conducted, and should additional fraud be uncovered, further criminal charges may be filed. The room exploded in whispers. Karen tried to protest, but John could already see the realization dawning in her eyes. This wasn't just a legal loss. Her reign over Willow Creek was over. Karen Wallace had always been a force to be reckoned with in Willow Creek. But after the trial, she wasn't just defeated. She was humiliated. Her reputation, once impeccable among the HOA loyalists, was now in ruins. The news of her sentencing spread fast, and neighbors who once whispered in agreement with her now whispered about her. No one visited her anymore. No one cared about her updates on community standards. She had become a cautionary tale, a warning about what happened when you let power go to your head. John saw the first signs of real change when he received an envelope in the mail, this time not from the HOA, but from a group of residents. Inside was a handwritten note, signed by nearly 24 people. Mr. Carlisle, we owe you an apology. We didn't see what was happening. Thank you for standing up for yourself. And, ultimately, for all of us. We're making sure this never happens again. John read it twice. He wasn't the sentimental type, but even he had to admit. It felt good. With Karen disgraced, the entire HOA board was thrown into disarray. investigations into the finances led to the resignation of multiple members, and soon a new election was announced. For the first time in years, the residents of Willow Creek had a say in who actually ran their community. John had no interest in participating, but he watched from the sidelines as a group of reformers took control. Their first order of business? Rewriting the HOA rules to prevent abuse of power. Banning any single person from holding absolute authority. Holding open meetings where every resident had a voice. It was like the neighborhood was waking up from a long nightmare. John had assumed Karen would try to fight back, but instead she vanished from public life. The once proud woman who had paraded through the streets of Willow Creek, barking orders and sending out fines, now barely left her house. Rumors swirled that she was selling her home, unable to stand the humiliation of living in a place where no one feared her anymore. One morning, John saw a moving truck parked in front of her house. A for sale sign stood planted on her lawn. She was finally leaving. With Karen gone and the HOA restructured, the neighborhood slowly transformed. John noticed things he hadn't before. More families hosting gatherings without worrying about being reported for noise violations. Kids playing in front yards without parents nervously checking for an HOA officer. People stopping to talk to one another instead of whispering behind closed doors. For the first time since he moved in, Willow Creek felt like a real community. And as John sat on his porch watching the sunset, he realized something. He had won. But more importantly, so had everyone else. A week after Karen moved out, John was enjoying a quiet evening on his porch, sipping his coffee and watching the neighborhood settle into its new, Karen-free reality. The air felt lighter. The tension that once lingered over Willow Creek, finally gone. Then, as if on cue, a black luxury SUV pulled up in front of his property. John set his mug down and leaned forward, watching as the driver's door opened. Karen Wallace stepped out. For a moment, John thought she might have returned for some grand final act of defiance. But as she walked up his driveway, he noticed something different about her. Gone was the proud, arrogant posture, the ever-present air of superiority. Instead, she looked defeated. She stopped a few feet away and took off her sunglasses, revealing tired eyes that had once burned with self-righteousness. "John," she said, her voice quieter than he'd ever heard it. "Karen," he replied, crossing his arms. "Figured you'd be halfway out of town by now." She let out a small, bitter laugh, shaking her head. "I am," she admitted. "But I needed to say something first." John raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. Karen exhaled slowly. I was wrong." John blinked. He hadn't expected that. "I let power go to my head," Karen continued, glancing down at the gravel beneath her feet. "I thought I was protecting the community, but all I was doing was controlling it. I see that now." John studied her for a moment. "And you're telling me this because—" Karen hesitated. "Because you were right. About all of it." She looked back up at him, her expression unreadable. "And I know an apology won't change anything, but I wanted to say it anyway." John let out a slow breath, then gave a small nod. "Took you long enough." Karen huffed a small, humorless laugh. "Yeah, I guess it did." She hesitated for another second, then extended her hand. John stared at it. A handshake? After everything? For a moment he considered leaving her hanging, but then he sighed, reached out, and shook it once. Karen gave him one last look, then turned, walked back to her SUV, and drove away for good. As the taillights disappeared down the road, John smirked to himself, picked up his coffee, and leaned back in his chair. Power had never belonged to Karen. She had only borrowed it, until the people took it back. And that was the real victory.